Welcome once again, my fellow manipulators of Digital Fate. I'm Richie, this is Capricorn, and today we're back at it with another spoiler video for TARKIR DRAGONSTORM. Now, in the last video, I explained that I was away for a week covering the first Shattering, which was the launch event for a brand new card game called Wonders of the First, which I am super excited about, and I have videos coming covering that game, so look forward to that. But because of that, I missed out on a lot of the spoiler days, so we're compiling them all. I already put an entire week 1 video out with all the spoilers from the first week, and this one's going to cover all of the weekend spoilers that happened while I was gone, and then we should pretty much be caught up at that point, and we can do the daily spoiler videos until the end of spoiler season. So we're going to run through these. There are a lot of cards that were spoiled over the weekend, and I'm super excited about it. Before we do, please like the video, subscribe. All that stuff really helps out the channel. It helps me get out to so many more people, and I would appreciate it so much. Now let's dive in. The first card we have to talk about is Coordinated Maneuver. This is 1 white and 1 for an instant, and you choose one. Coordinated Maneuver deals damage equal to the number of creatures you control to target creature or planeswalker, or you destroy target enchantment. So I love being able to include this incidental enchantment removal in your main deck in Limited, but still have access to a card that's really good if you don't need to kill an enchantment. I think the one thing about this that stands out to me the most is the fact that you can do the damage to a planeswalker as well, which isn't normally the case with a spell like this, especially for a common. So there's a lot of adaptability here, and you could do a lot worse than to include something like this in your limited deck. Next up, we've got Dragonologist. This is a 1/3 human wizard for 1 blue and 2. And when it enters, you look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may reveal an instant, sorcery, or dragon card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order, and untapped dragons you control have hexproof. This does a lot, right? Being able to look at the top 6 cards and just grab the best card is pretty nuts. You obviously want to be playing dragons, right? And they're going to get the hexproof buff. So being able to grab a dragon from the top 6 as well as an instant or sorcery is really nice. A lot of times, cards like this that just try to grab a non-creature spell, it's hard because you have to balance very carefully creatures that get the value off the spells and then the spells themselves. But being able to grab a dragon here means you don't need to worry as much about that, right? You can just load up your deck with dragons, and even if you don't have a lot of instants or sorceries, you're still almost always going to hit with this thing. And then give all of your untapped dragons hexproof, which really just gives your opponent another hoop they have to jump through before they can kill your dragons. They got to kill the Dragonologist first, which is actually really good because it already replaced itself with the best card from the top 6. So if you get to bait out their removal, find the best card from the top 6 to replace it, and make them lose a little bit of tempo advantage in the process just so they can finally get back to a point where they can kill your dragons, that's all pretty good. It kind of puts them behind, right? So I sort of love this as like a Trojan horse that gets them to waste their removal while you just got value off of it. And yeah, we're gonna brew around that one for sure. Next up, we've got Effortless Master. This is a 4/3 Orc Monk with Vigilance and Menace for 4 mana in the colors of Izzet. That's already a lot, but also when this creature enters, it enters with 2 +1/+1 counters on it if you've cast 2 or more spells this turn. What's important to note about that is it does count itself. So as long as you've cast at least 1 other spell, this will come in with 2 counters, which seems crazy? Wait a minute. Yeah, because it tracks whether you've cast it before it tracks that it's entered. So on enter, it will count it as a cast. That's nuts, man. That is so crazy. And it doesn't have to be a non-creature spell. Worst case scenario, you could Hangerback Walker for 0 and still cast this on turn 4 as a 6/5 Vigilance Menace, which is a little bit of a waste of the Hangerback Walker, so I don't think you'll actually do that. But it's cool that there's the possibility of things like that lining up with this card. I actually really like this card. This is going to be stupid good and limited, and it might even see constructed play because I think it's just statted. It's just statted like crazy. Next up, we've got Host of the Hereafter. a 2/2 zombie warlock for 4 mana in the colors of Golgari. This creature enters with 2 +1/+1 counters on it, just straight up. So it's a 4 mana 4/4 that counts as a zombie and counts as an outlaw. That's already pretty cool. Whenever this creature or another creature you control dies, if it had counters on it, put its counters on up to 1 target creature you control. Yeah, this is just great. This really makes me want to build some kind of a zombie tribal deck. It just seems like we're getting more and more support for zombies with every set, and it's only a matter of time before we hit critical mass and there's a really good zombie deck in the standard meta, so that's kind of exciting. This is just good for a lot of different reasons all around, to be completely honest. Yeah, it's just a good creature. Divvies up its counters. You're going to play it in limited. It might see play in constructed, potentially. We'll have to wait and see. I'm sort of a little bit hesitant to say it'll be used for sure in constructed because it is still a little bit slow at 4 mana. But if you have enough synergies that rely on counters or death triggers or both, or even just zombie tribal, this could end up making the cut under the right circumstances. Next up, we've got Riverwheel Sweep. I'm tired, leave me alone. This is a sorcery for 3 mana in the colors of Jeskai, but it's hybrid mana, so either of those colors can be replaced by 2 colorless, which means theoretically you could play this in a mono black deck and just spend 6 mana, which is kind of bananas. Tap target creature, put 3 stun counters on it, exile the top 2 cards of your library, choose one of them. Until the end of your next turn, you may play that card. I mean, this is just awesome. This is just awesome, man. I mean, it's not going to be that great outside of Jeskai, but if you can play this for 3 mana, replace itself with the best of 2 cards, and lock down your opponent's creatures for 3 turns... like, that's a lot. That's a lot. Normally, the downside of the stun thing is you're gaining tempo advantage, but you're losing card advantage, right? You're giving up a whole card, and eventually when those stun counters are gone, you don't have anything to show for it. But replacing itself with another card to play while tapping a creature down for 3 or 4 turns is honestly super good. If you're playing Jeskai in limited, you're playing this card. Like, slam it, get it early because it will not table, and play the damn card. This might even see play in some kind of Jeskai control deck. I think it has that much potential, like in standard. But next up, we've got Monastery Messenger, a 2/3 bird scout with flying and vigilance for the same cost as the last card. 3 mana in the colors of Jeskai, but it's hybrid. When this creature enters, you put up to 1 target non-creature, non-land card from your graveyard on top of your library. This isn't super good, but it's not bad either. If you're in Jeskai and you can actually play this for 3, this should be pretty good and limited. A 2/3 flying vigilance that's swinging in and lowering the clock every turn, but also you can keep it up as a flying blocker every turn as well, and get back, you know, your best removal spell or whatever on top of your library so that you can keep harassing your opponent's board state. You could do a lot worse when it comes to commons, so I think this is pretty good. If you're not really in the right colors for it, it gets a lot worse. If you have to spend 4 or even 5 mana for this, that's super rough. But if you can jam this for 3, this is going to be really good and limited. Next up, we've got Bone-cairn Butcher, a 4/4 demon with Mobilize 2 for 4 mana in the colors of Mardu. Attacking tokens you control have Death Touch. I love everything about this. Just gives you a strict buff to all of your other tokens, even tokens that aren't made by this guy. Also gives you a 4/4 for 4, which as an uncommon is fine. It's not like amazing, but that's the kind of stat line you usually want to see and you usually don't see unless you're in green. As far as limited's concerned. And then you get the Mobilize 2. So you're always swinging with 2/1/1 death touchers as long as this creature attacks. So you do have to make sure that they're not going to be able to trade with your dude in combat. And you can only activate the Mobilize if you attack. So there is a bit of a risk there. But still, even if you're not attacking with this dude and you're using other mobilized things, that's where it gets interesting, right? You can pick and choose. If you don't want to risk losing this guy, you know, attack with your other guys that have mobilize. Get some tokens that way and still utilize the Death Touch without putting yourself in a position where you could lose the Bone-cairn Butcher in combat and lose access to the Death Touch on subsequent turns. So I do think there's some really interesting synergy just built into this card that it works super well with a lot of other cards. But just being able to mobilize to yourself in the right circumstances as well is pretty nutty. It's pretty nutty. So I really love this card in Limited. It's possible it could see play in Constructed. I don't think it will. But you could do a lot worse than to just like creature factory out 2 tokens every single turn with Death Touch. You just have to make sure you can actually pull it off without losing your Bone-cairn Butcher. Next up, we've got Essence Anchor. This is an artifact for 1 blue and 2. At the beginning of your upkeep, you surveil 1. You can tap it to create a 2/2 black zombie druid creature token. Activate only during your turn and only if a card left your graveyard this turn. Interesting. Are we going to see like a Sultai Roots deck? Where this just helps you fill up your graveyard and then just makes you an extra 2/2 every turn? Maybe? I don't think it's quite powerful enough or at least efficiently costed enough to make the cut in those decks. But if you did have a deck that cared about the graveyard and also cared about Zombie Tribal, where that 2/2 that you're making is worth more than just a 2/2 because it's going to pick up a bunch of zombie synergies, then you're talking. Then there's potential for this card to actually see play in Standard. But even if you just use this in Limited, this is kind of a no-brainer. If you can draft enough cards that can exile from the graveyard or use some of the new mechanics to exile themselves from the graveyard, where you're making zombies consistently enough, then I think this is great. If you can almost definitely guarantee making a zombie every turn, and then you also have the Surveil one on top of that for just even more card selection and versatility, like, I think this card is nuts. So, you have to be in the right deck, you have to set it up properly, and then it's great. Even if you're not in the right deck, I mean, if this thing spits out even two tokens over the course of the game, that's pretty damn on rate, right? Getting to Surveil 1 once a turn for the rest of the game and get 2/2/2s out of a 3-mana thing. So I think even in Limited, this should be really good. Next up, we've got Heritage Reclamation, an instant for 1 green and 1. You choose one, destroy an artifact, destroy an enchantment, or exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard, and then draw a card. This is a nice little bit of, like, common removal. It's a way to get artifact or enchantment removal into your main deck without wasting a card if you don't need it, because you get that, you know, access to drawing a card with a little bit of gravy, exiling something from a graveyard on top of it. So you can do a lot worse than to have something like this in your deck. Next up, we've got Kishla Skimmer, a 2/2 bird scout with flying for 2 mana in the colors of Simic. Whenever a card leaves your graveyard during your turn, you draw a card, but this ability triggers only once each turn. What an interesting card. It's not quite worth it with Roots, I don't think. Like a Temur Roots style build. Like, you could go there. But I think at this point we're hitting critical mass of cards that are good in Roots decks. And so you have to be especially good to make the cut. Because there's just so much value floating around for those decks. But there's definitely a place for a card like this, especially in Limited, right? There are gonna be tons of ways to utilize this in the specific archetype that's trying to do this, using the mechanics within the set to exile stuff from your graveyard. We've seen a few different mechanics already that allow you to exile stuff or even have it built into the card that it can exile itself from the graveyard. So getting to get free gas off of this guy and draw a card every time that happens can be really good synergy if you have enough of those cards. And on the back of a 2/2 flyer for 2, which honestly by itself is really good in Limited. Getting a 2/2 flyer down on turn 2, you can ride that to victory sometimes. Granted, you do need to keep in mind the fact that this set is full of dragons. There's a lot more flying in this set than we usually see in most sets, so it's not going to be as good as it would be in a different set, but it's still going to be really good and limited, I think. So, yeah, grab this quick because it's not going to table. Next up, we've got War Effort. 1 red and 3 for an enchantment. Creatures you control get +1/+0. And whenever you attack, you make a 1/1 red warrior creature token that's tapped and attacking, and have to sack it at the beginning of the next end step. This is pretty cool. This is a way to mobilize without having to put one of your creatures at risk, because you can attack with anything. You don't have to attack with something specific to trigger like a mobilize. You just attack with whichever creature can safely attack in that given situation, and you get your token, right? And the token itself is really going to be a 2/1, and the thing that's attacking is going to have a +1 buff as well. And then you still have the ability to sacrifice it for value after combat if it survives combat. So there are a lot of different ways you can create value with this card, whether you're in just an aristocrat style deck, sacrifice style deck, or just a go wide deck that's trying to be super aggressive, and this buffs your team as well as giving you value each turn. Like, there's a lot of different ways to utilize this. I think it's going to be super good and limited just because it gives you endless value every turn. I like it a lot. Next up, we've got Quarry Mountain Stalwart. This is a 3/3 human monk with Flurry for 3 mana in the colors of Boros. Flurry basically means you activate a thing if you cast your second spell each turn. So when you cast your second spell each turn, this creature deals 2 damage to each opponent and you gain 2 life. So you get a mini lightning helix to your opponent's head every time you cast your second spell. That's actually super good. You could go shock, and they take 6 and you gain 2. And then on their turn, you could go shock, and they take 6 and you gain 2. That's... This card's going to be super helpful in trying to race aggro because of the incidental life gain. And also you could probably end the game earlier than you typically would, because you can just hit them in the dome for 2 every time you cast your second spell, which if you're building your deck properly, you know, is going to be happening pretty much every turn. Yeah, this guy's sweet, man. I don't know if he's quite sweet enough to see play in Standard and Constructed, but he absolutely is nuts and limited. You grab him if you're in those colors and you try to focus on some kind of a prowess build, and you just go ham, right? But it's possible even in Constructed there's some kind of crazy new burn deck where this just amplifies all the damage that you're putting out. If I was a betting man, I'd say probably not, because it is, you know, fragile, it's susceptible to removal, it's a little expensive, costs 3 to get out, all that good stuff. But there's definitely a chance. Next up, we've got Death Begets Life, our first mythic today. This is a sorcery for a whopping 8 mana in the colors of Sultai. You destroy all creatures and enchantments and draw a card for each permanent destroyed this way. What a crazy card. If this thing wasn't so expensive, I'd be a little bit more excited. 8 mana is very prohibitive. It means only very specific kinds of decks can run this. Decks that are ramping pretty heavily early, or combo decks that are just getting Omniscience into play super early. But if you're getting Omniscience into play super early, first of all, you don't really need this, right? Because you're probably just comboing to a win at that point. And second of all, you'll kill your own Omniscience if you cast it, so that seems bad. It would be cool to have some kind of a weird pixie or sacrifice brew where you play all of the different artifacts and enchantments that give you value off ETB, like Hopeless Nightmare and stuff like that. And then when you play this, it just wipes all those enchantments, and you draw a card for each one, as well as killing your opponent's stuff and drawing even more cards. So that could be pretty cool as like a top end for an enchantment heavy deck, like a control deck. The only problem is you still need a ton of mana. So at the end of the day, you still need to be ramping. It needs to be a ramp deck primarily, so that you can consistently get to the point where you can play this. And that really limits the amount of decks something like this is actually useful in. That being said, we've seen a ton of high mana cost stuff in this set so far. So it seems like they're pushing things in that direction, and maybe there are going to be a lot more ways to enable, you know, really expensive spells like this than we've seen already. So we'll have to wait and see once the full set is spoiled. But either way, this is a really interesting card. Next up, we've got Tersa Light Shatter. She's a 3/3 legendary orc wizard with haste for 1 red and 2. And when she enters, you discard up to 2 cards and then draw that many cards. Whenever she attacks, if there are 7 or more cards in your graveyard, you exile a card at random from your graveyard and you may play that card this turn. So she's kind of like Kiora. She costs the same amount of mana. She makes you discard 2 and draw 2 like Kiora, with the one upside to this card being that you don't have to discard 2. You could discard 1 and just draw 1. So you have a little bit more choice in that. Whereas the upside with Kiora is you draw the cards before you choose to discard. So you could draw worse things that you can then discard and not have to worry about, you know, ditching something good in your hand and then drawing trash. So when it comes to that part of the ability, each of them kind of has their pros and cons. But Tersa having haste means you get to activate it right away, right? So no matter what, you get a thing that you can play. The big problem is you have to play it this turn. It's not until the end of your next turn. So you do have to be very careful about how you use Tersa and when you use Tersa, which makes the haste not as valuable as it otherwise would be. If you could just jam this on 3 and swing and tuck a card away in exile to play the next turn, it would be absolutely bananas. But because you have to do it this turn, it's really difficult to get all of the value. To be able to play her as soon as possible, swing in with the haste, and still be able to cast the thing that you hit. That being said, she's still really good, right? The haste is not nothing, and getting to replay a card from your graveyard every turn is sometimes better than the 8/8 that Kiora makes, especially when you consider the fact that the 8/8 Kiora makes is legendary, so once you get it once, you can't keep getting value. This can just keep getting value. In fact, you could exile, if you end up exiling a Kiora from your graveyard, then you get the Kiora into play, and then you have the best of both worlds, and that seems pretty cool. I also really like this with Monument to Endurance, because you discard a bunch of stuff to trigger the monument, and then you have things in your graveyard that you can play that will also probably trigger the monument, or if you ended up discarding the monument, you could get the monument back with the Tersa. So there might be some kind of monument build with Tersa as well, which is pretty interesting. But next up, we've got Sonic Shrieker, a 4/4 flying dragon for 5 mana in the colors of Mardu. When it enters, it deals 2 damage to any target, and you gain 2 life. If a player is dealt damage this way, they discard a card. What an awesome card, man. This reminds me so heavily of Flametongue Kavu. It costs 1 extra mana and does 2 less damage. But it's got a bigger butt, higher toughness. It flies. It gains you 2 life, and if you choose to do the damage to the dome, you make them discard a card. So no matter what, you're getting 2 for 1 value out of this guy. You're either picking off one of their 2 toughness guys, or you're hitting them in the head and making them discard a card. And either way, you're gaining 2 life, and you have a 4/4 flyer for the rest of the game, at least until they get rid of it. I love this, man. This is not like the most insane card ever. I don't know if it's good enough. It probably isn't for constructed, for standard. But this is exactly the kind of card that I love and would love to play with and try to get, like, eke the most value out possible. It kind of reminds me of a time when Magic felt more balanced, and that's probably just because it's an uncommon, right? And it's not as pushed because it's not a rare. But this reminds me of, like, the way rares used to be, and they would be valuable cards, but not insanely pushed and turned up to 11 the way that power creep is today. So I really love this card. I really wish that we were in a standard environment that wasn't so power crept so that I could actually play this in standard. It's still possible you could play this in standard. I would say probably not, but it's possible. You know what this would be decent with? The 𝐒𝐏𝐻𝐿 ceremony card that we saw on, I forget exactly what day that was spoiled, but it was the first week spoilers. The 𝐒𝐏𝐻𝐿 ceremony. This could come down for just 3 mana. And even though you have to you know, it dies to the 𝐒𝐏𝐻𝐿 ceremony, you still get to deal your 2 damage, gain your 2 life, make them discard if you hit them in the head, and then get a 2/2 zombie out of it for 3 mana, which is kind of cool too. Probably not good enough, but I don't know. I'm just spitballing ideas. I just really like this card. I don't think it'll see standard play, which is a shame, but it's going to be absolutely nuts and limited. I think this guy is going to be... He might even be underestimated because the value seems so, like, under the radar in a way, but I really love him. Next up, Snakeskin Veil. Makes its return. An instant for 1 green mana, put a counter on target creature, and it gains hexproof until end of turn. The ultimate protection spell that gives you lasting value when your opponent tries to remove your dude. It'll be just as useful here as it is in every other set it's been printed in. Next up, we've got Fresh Start. 1 blue and 1 for an enchantment aura with flash. Chance a creature. Enchanted creature gets -5/-0 and loses all abilities. This is particularly good just because of the flash. You can use it as a combat trick to protect your guy that blocks, or possibly even if you were going to trade with their creature, now your guy survives and their guy dies. So as a combat trick, this is more like a protection combat trick, which is really interesting, but it can also be used sort of as removal. You hit their, you know, big, strong 4 or 5 power guy that they are attacking in with and going to close out the game with, and now they can't anymore, especially if it's like a dragon, a flyer, or whatever. Taking away all of their flyers' power and making them have to lean on their ground guys again, and maybe the board is gummed up with ground guys of your own, and now they can't kill you like they could have, is pretty good. So I think this will be a pretty highly sought after removal for blue, especially when you consider the fact that blue doesn't get a lot of removal. That being said, these decks are going to focus on three color clans, so every deck's going to have a lot more access to splashed removal from other colors than a blue deck typically would in other sets. So that makes me think this might not be as necessary as I otherwise would think. So I don't know. We're going to have to wait and see. Either way, I think it's a pretty interesting card because of the flash. But next up, we've got Twin Maw Stormbrood. This is a 5/4 flying dragon for 1 white and 5, and when it enters, you gain 5 life. Really cool top end, right? If you happen to just draw into this a little bit later in the game, you just slam it for 6, regain your life you lost early to aggro, and have a giant flyer out. That's not bad, especially when it's splashable. But it's also attached to a sorcery omen called Sharing Bite. For 1 red and 1, it deals 5 damage to target creature without flying. So it's pretty obvious here that you get to have your big end game creature that you have at the top end of your curve, without the downside of it being stuck in your hand and useless if you're not at a point in the game when you can play it, because you just use this to kill pretty much any creature that they're curving out with, unless it happens to fly. This is going to be really good removal as you're curving out. So again, I can't stress how important it is to evaluate these cards based on what one thing can do as you're curving out earlier, and what one thing can give you for value way later in the game if you actually do have the mana to play it. And that's what makes these cards so strong, is it's that versatility. You know, you can have this big creature in your deck that's not a dead draw if you need to play something early. You can also have removal in your deck that you could play early that's not a dead draw if you draw this later and you're staring down at another huge dragon on the other side and you can't use the removal anymore. So they kind of cover each other's weaknesses, and I think a lot of these dragons that have omens attached have a similar feel, and I think they're going to be some of the strongest cards in the set when it comes to draft specifically, because being at uncommon, they're going to be very prevalent, and some of them are even at common, and they're just going to do a lot of work for you, I think. So I really like this one. But next up, we've got Yathin Roadwatcher, a 3/3 human scout for 4 mana in the colors of Abzan. When it enters, if you cast it, you mill 4 cards, and when you do, return a creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. That's right, to the battlefield. This card's bananas. This card is so good, and I really feel like people are going to just overlook how good this is. You could use this in a deck with Alesha and Rutstein, and you could use Rutstein to get back Alesha. You could use this to get back Alesha. You can use this to get back Rutstein. You can use Rutstein to get back this. If you build up counters on your Alesha, use your Alesha to get back this or the Rutstein. And then you could take it one step further. You could play this with 6/6 Ceremony, and it comes down for only 3 mana instead of 4. Immediately dies, replaces itself with a 2/2 zombie, but still triggers its ability and gets a 3-drop back. So if you played a 3-drop earlier, and the 6/6 Ceremony destroyed it and gave you a token, and now it's sitting in your graveyard, it's primed to just bring back with the Yathen Roadwatcher while getting another 2/2 zombie in the process and getting that cost reduction, which I think is just awesome. There's so many ways I want to use this card, but I'm really... The fact that it's a human, and Alesha's a human, and Rutstein's a human, like 4-color human tribal with everything but blue, it's already a deck I've flirted with that's really powerful, and I think this card's just going to be nuts in it. So I'm excited to brew that deck. I'm excited to brew this with the 6/6 Ceremony. I think this card's just awesome, and I also think it's going to kind of slip under the radar with how good it is, because you're like, oh, you're paying 4 mana and you're getting a 3-drop, like whatever. This is valuable, right? And if you flicker this, you get to keep getting things back. If you Pixie this and replay it, you can get something back. Not that you'd necessarily want to play this in Pixie. But also it's easy to overlook the fact that it mills you 4 cards. So also, if it's in a deck where you want cards in your graveyard for other stuff you're doing, it gives you even more value. Yeah, this card's awesome. I love it. I'm going to brew with it for sure on day 1. But next up, we've got Narset's Rebuke. An instant for 1 red and 4. Deals 5 damage to target creature. And you get to add 3 mana to your mana pool in the colors of Jeskai. If that creature would die this turn, you exile it instead. This is really interesting because it's risk reward. If you don't have a spell that you can set up with this, it ends up being 5 mana for an instant speed, 5 damage, exile the thing, which is still not the worst thing ever for common removal, but definitely not optimal, definitely overcosted. But if you can line up the right things and actually use that 3 mana you get, this is bananas, man. The one thing that's a little tricky is the fact that it's an instant, so you want to try to save it to do in response to things at instant speed to get more value off of it being an instant. But at the same time, you want to be able to use that mana, and a lot of times you might have to use that mana on something that's sorcery speed. So you are going to have difficult decisions to make about do you hold this up, or do you just use it almost like it's sorcery speed removal to get the mana and try to get the tempo lead, the mana advantage. But I think that's a good thing. I think, you know, creating those space for those decisions to make those decisions just makes the game that much more interesting. I can't wait to play with this in Limited and just see how things line up with it. Should be pretty fun. But next up, we've got Alesha's Legacy, an instant for 1 black and 1. Target creature control gains Death Touch and indestructible until end of turn. I'm going to point out that a card like this is super good with Menace, and we've seen a fair number of Menace creatures in this set already. But if you can attack with a Menace creature and force your opponent to block it with 2 creatures, and then instant speed give it Death Touch and indestructible, your guy stays alive no matter what. Both of their guys die, and you get like insane value off this one card. So it's fun that you're going to be able to do a trick like that in Limited. As far as Constructed, we have other versions of this card with different names, and they're not really seeing play, so I don't really expect too much in Constructed. Although if there is a super good Menace deck in Standard in particular, cards like this, either this one or some of the other differently named cards that are functionally identical, could be worth adding to decks like that. We've done that in the past, and it's a pretty fun deck, but I think Menace needs a little bit more power before it's at the point where it's really worth playing to contend with the standard meta. But next up, we've got Avenger of the Fallen. This is a 2/4 human warrior with Death Touch for 1 black and 2. It also has Mobilize X, where X is the number of creature cards in your graveyard. This is really interesting. If you're in a self-mill deck, it ups the value of this. If you're just in a crazy go-wide deck where your opponent is forced to kill a bunch of your stuff, that's another way to incidentally get creatures into your graveyard and get more value out of this, which is cool. And no matter how much value you get out of this, this thing itself has Death Touch and a decent butt. So they're going to have to trade something substantial or multiple things for this to finally get rid of it and shut it down. And if they don't, you just kind of keep mobilizing for more and more and more every turn. And it becomes overwhelming, especially in a deck where you might have sacrifice payoffs or things that trigger on creatures dying, because all of those tokens are going to be able to be used in that way pretty much every turn. So this could get really, really nutty if used just right, and I sort of love it. And again, I just want to point out it's another human. Like, human tribal seems like it's primed to be kind of bananas, and I'm excited to try out a lot of these cards. But next up, we've got Breaching Dragonstorm, an enchantment for 1 red and 4. When it enters, you exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card. You can cast it without paying its mana cost if its mana value is 8 or less. And if you don't, you put it into your hand. And when a dragon you control enters, you get to return this enchantment to its owner's hand. This is probably my favorite of the Dragonstorms that I've seen so far. And it's huge risk, huge reward, right? You dump a ton of 8 cost spells or 7 or 8 cost spells into your deck and hope you hit one. And if you whiff, you roll the dice again by playing a dragon and replaying this and hope you hit one again. And that just sounds really interesting. I feel like there's probably a way to chain this. If you hit a dragon that's 7 or 8 mana, you just play the dragon for free, and playing the card for free is the thing that then returns the Dragonstorm to your hand, which is awesome. So if you have a way to generate mana off of the dragon that you hit, if there are any dragons that generate you mana, I believe there's at least one, right? There's the guy from Eldraine that lets you bargain to create 4 mana. I could see a world where you bargain one of the lesser Dragonstorms, and when it enters, it returns this Dragonstorm, gives you the 4 mana, and then you have the mana to just recast it and do it again. And then maybe you hit an even bigger dragon, like an 8-drop or something. I could see a world where there's some kind of ridiculously weird combo dragon deck that uses this. And I think that would be super fun. At the end of the day, it probably ends up being too cute to be worth trying to actually run and be competitive with. But there is a possibility, depending on what other cards are coming in this set, that something like that could be bananas and worth exploring. I'm going to keep it in mind for the early access event, because if we get the right support for it, that could be a really interesting combo deck that could be kind of nuts. So I don't know, let me know what you think about it in the comments. But next up, we've got Dragonstorm Globe, an artifact for 3 colorless mana, can tap to add a mana of any color, so it's another mana rock. We've seen a lot of mana rocks in this set, but this one is the common one. And it has another ability where each dragon you control enters with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. Just free value in Dragon Tribal. It makes it a little bit easier to go like 4 or 5 colors. I could see a world where you can draft into like a 4 or 5 color deck using a lot of this fixing, a lot of these multicolor mana rocks and tri-lands and stuff like that. It'll be interesting to see just how realistic it is to try and go 4 or 5 colors in limited in this set. I'm excited to see if it's possible. Because if you do, you could kind of just play all your dragons, right? If you can go like 4 or 5 colors, you can just hard focus on dragons, play all of your dragons, and then something like this gives you that much more value because of that, as well as the other dragon payoffs. I think that's pretty interesting. So I'll be trying this one out in limited, 100%. Next up, we've got Flamehold Grappler, a 3/3 human monk with first strike, another human, for 3 mana in the colors of Jeskai, which is honestly already pretty good. A 3/3 first striker for 3 that picks up human tribal benefits. But when it enters, you get to copy the next spell you cast this turn when you cast it, and you may choose new targets for the copy. The important thing to note about this is it doesn't have to copy a non-creature spell, or like an instant or sorcery. It can copy anything. If you somehow play a Portal to Phyrexia after the Flamehold Grappler, you get 2 Portal to Phyrexias, and it comes in as a token. Not only that, but you can further abuse the fact that it comes in as a token with things like Caretaker's Talent or 3 Blind Mice or whatever the case may be. So there's a lot of ways to just suck even more value out of this card and get more potential out of it, which I love. But I also just love that even if you're not set up to make the best possible play, you're still getting a 3/3 first striker. That's not nothing. Like, that'll put a lot of pressure on your opponent and on the board state. So it's kind of a win all around for me. And I can't wait to just brew with this. This card looks bananas. I also really like the art. It's one of my favorite arts I've seen from the set. There's something about it that's just striking to me. And I really like it. I think this card's awesome. Let me know in the comments how you'd use it, because I feel like the sky's the limit with this one. But next up, we've got Dragonstorm Forecaster, a 0/3 human scout for 1 blue mana. You pay 2, tap him, search your library for a card named Dragonstorm Globe or Boulderborn Dragon, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. This is crazy. This is absolutely crazy. The thing that I want to point out about this right away, it's not limited to once, right? If you draft 3 Boulderborn Dragons, you can search for a Boulderborn Dragon three turns in a row. Like, essentially drawing into 3 relevant threats for free. Well, not for free, you have to spend mana, right? But still, that's nuts, man. And the fact that you can find other things too, like the Dragonstorm Globe, like, that increases the chances of being able to draft enough things to use this with to actually make it viable. If it was just one or the other, it would probably be a little too risky to try to pick up early in a draft, on the off chance that, like, none of the cards you need to use it with come around and then you, like, wasted your early pick. But the fact that this can hit 2 different things, even if one of them, I haven't seen these other cards, but even if one of them's, like, way better than the other, just having the ability to pick up some of the other card, to just be able to get more value out of a card like this, just gives you that consistency, that extra consistency you kind of need to risk trying to go this route in draft. And I sort of love that. So, yeah, this card's awesome. But next up, we've got Teeming Dragonstorm. This is an enchantment for 1 white and 3. And, hi. What are you doing? She snuck up. You are not a dragon. This is not your storm. Teeming Dragonstorm. 1 white and 3 for an enchantment. When this enchantment enters, you create 2 2/2 white soldier creature tokens. Already pretty good. 4 mana for 2 2/2 tokens and an enchantment that's there to be sacrificed or picked up with the pixie or whatever the case may be. It's already kind of good. When a dragon you control enters, you're distracting me. When a dragon you control enters, return this enchantment to its owner's hand. So, just like all the Dragonstorms, you can pick it up without needing something like a pixie to pick it up. You just play a dragon and you pick it up. I kind of love that. I also just sort of love this in a sacrifice deck. Like, just play this, get 2 2/2 tokens, and then sack the enchantment for value to, like, a Disturbing Mirth or something in a Mardu sack deck. Is this good enough to actually do that? It might be a little too slow. But it's still pretty cool that it has this, you know, extra value just kind of built into the card for free. I like everything about this. It's going to be super good and limited. I don't know how good it will be constructed, but the potential is at least there, getting 3 permanents for 1 card. Next up, we've got Feral Deathgorger. This is another Omen Dragon. This is a 3/5 dragon for 1 black and 5. It has flying, it has Death Touch, and when this creature enters, you exile up to 2 target cards from a single graveyard. This is really good for a common. Like I said, normally, if you had a dragon like this, you'd be hesitant about including it in your deck, or at least hesitant about including too many in your deck. Because if they're in your hand early, and you don't have enough stuff to curve out with, and this is just a dead card in your hand you can't play, that's really problematic. So what you want is you want the ability to make sure that in the late game, if you draw this, you'll be able to cast it. You'll be able to just play it as the dragon and get that value off having, like, a strong late game play. But you don't want the downside of risking having an expensive card stuck in your hand the whole game that you can't use, and if you had just had one other card that you could use while curving out, you would have been able to stay in the game, but you didn't because you had a 6-drop or whatever. These Omen creatures, they solve that problem, right? They solve that problem without the brokenness of adventures giving you both. So if you have this early and it's just sitting in your hand and you need to play something and get some value, you just spend 2 mana, put a counter on a creature, and draw a card. Like, that's good. Draws a card to replace itself, gets shuffled back in the deck, you get a counter to get a little bit of extra value out of it, and then it's ready to be drawn later on in the game when you do have enough mana to play it. So, kind of a perfect setup. I get the gut feeling that people are going to overlook how good these are, just because they don't give you both like an adventure. But I think having that charm aspect to them, where you have the versatility of choosing how to use it and you're not stuck with an expensive card in your hand dead for the whole game, and then your opponent kills you before you ever get the mana to cast it, without that downside, with that downside being completely mitigated, it opens up a whole world where now you can just put these expensive creatures into your deck without that fear, and just have a bunch of insane top end hits that you could get that could put in a lot of value later on in the game. So I'm excited to try and use them that way. I think they're going to be super effective and probably way better than most people are thinking right now. But next up we've got Herd Heirloom. Heirloom. It's not a heir apparent, it's a Herd Heirloom. An artifact for 1 green and 1. And we were just talking about mana rocks, right? And how many there are in this set. You can tap it to add 1 mana of any color, but spend this mana only to cast a creature spell. So it's a 2 mana rock of literally any color. You just have to limit yourself to only using it on a creature. That's insane. That is super, super good. This is absolutely going to see play in like stompy decks and mid-range decks that are trying to get out bigger creatures as quick as possible. But then it has another ability. Tap it until end of turn. Target creature you control with power 4 or greater gains trample. And whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. So it's good in ramping out your huge threats, but then when you've ramped out everything from your hand and cast it all earlier than you should because of the ramp, and now you're out of gas because you just vomited it all out on the board, now it just acts as a way to refill that gas and get you more value. Give your best creature trample, make sure it gets through for damage, draw a card to gas up so that you can keep playing stuff. So it sort of just does everything. The more I think about this card, the more insane I feel like it is. The fact that you have ramp and color fixing on the one hand while it's early and you're curving out, but then just sheer card advantage value later on when you run out of gas from all the things you got to play out extra early from the mana ramp, just seems awesome. This thing's going to be hands down a bananas inclusion in standard. Like, it's going to be played a lot. If you are running green and you are running expensive creatures, you are playing this card. That's what it comes down to. And it'll be really interesting to see if a card like this helps like a mid-range green deck actually exist again and be competitive in the meta. I will definitely be trying it. But next up, we've got Rebellious Strike. This is an instant for 1 white and 1. Target creature gets +3/+0 until end of turn, and you draw a card. Anything that replaces itself as a cantrip is going to be especially good. Getting a combat trick that you can use at instant speed that does that, and doubles as a way to just like close out the game. If your attack would get your opponent to 3 life or less, now it's just lethal. You don't have to worry about trying to take a whole nother turn to get there. So this is really good. Just drawing a card and replacing itself cantripping is pretty nuts for a common, to be honest. And I think it'll be a pretty high pick as far as commons are concerned in limited. It might even see play in some prowess style decks, just so that you can keep cycling through your deck and drawing more cards, especially if you have a way of reducing the cost of this by 1 and only having to spend 1 white mana. At that point, it's a no-brainer. Like, you slam this in all the prowess decks and you trigger all the things and keep digging through your deck and it gets bananas. I don't know if there's a way to reduce the cost of this by 1, at least in an efficient way that a prowess deck would want to utilize. If there is a card like that in standard, let me know. or even in this set maybe, and will be included in Standard when the set drops. Let me know in the comments, because I feel like this could have potential in just the right deck in Standard, but it needs to line up like just perfect to make the cut. It's just going to be nuts and limited no matter what, so play it. Next up, we've got Hollow-Merc Siege. This is another one of the enchantments that come from the Siege cycle. This one is the Golgari one, so 1 green, 1 black. As it enters, you choose Sultai or Abzan. If you choose Sultai, whenever a counter is put on a creature you control, you draw a card, but it only triggers once a turn. So it kind of turns everything into a what's the vampire? 2-drop white vampire from Ixalan. I forget his name right now. It'll come to me later. But it sort of turns all of your creatures into that. Although it's worth noting that if you get creatures out with this ability, each of the creatures can trigger once a turn. Whereas with this, even if you put counters on different creatures in the same turn, you're only going to ever trigger the siege once, which is kind of a bummer. But it could still be pretty valuable. It's a lot easier to put a counter on any creature than to put a counter on a very specific creature. So it might just be a good way to get incidental card draw for only 2 mana every single turn, if it ends up just easy enough to just always have a counter hit something every turn. But then you also have Abzan that you can pick, and whenever you attack, you put a +1/+1 counter on target attacking creature. It gains menace until end of turn. So just like all the other sieges, we're seeing if you can get both in play, it would be really nuts. If you have a way to get double ETB triggers off this when it enters and choose both, the abilities just synergize and help each other. If you draw a second copy and you choose like Sultai the first time and Abzan the second time, they work really well with each other. So I think there is a lot of interesting build space around the sieges, and this one as well. Trying to utilize that sort of philosophy. This one's pretty interesting. I'll say that this one's less interesting than most of the other sieges we've seen so far, but there is still a lot of value to be had with it for sure. Next up, we've got Naga Fleshcrafter. This is a 0/0 snake shapeshifter for 1 blue and 3, and you may have this creature enter as a copy of any creature on the battlefield. It's important to note that you can copy your opponent's creatures with this. That's really important. But it also has Renew, so for 1 blue and 2, you can exile this from your graveyard to put a +1/+1 counter on target non-legendary creature you control. Each other creature you control becomes a copy of that creature until end of turn. Activate only as a sorcery. This could be absolutely devastating if used just right, and you could just play it the normal way you're supposed to and have it become a copy of something and have your opponent kill that and then use the Renew from the graveyard. But you could also just self-mill this pretty easily and just get it straight into the graveyard to just use the Renew right from the get-go. And I'm sure there are combos we can trigger out there with that Renew ability. Being able to turn every single creature into one of our other creatures seems kind of nuts. Like, what if we Renew and put a counter on, I don't know, an Unstoppable Slasher? Now, all of our creatures become Unstoppable Slashers until end of turn. They all swing in. They can double damage when they hit. And any of them that get traded for that die in combat will come back with stun counters on them. Even though they'll come back as their original versions, they will still trigger that in that way and come back, which is kind of interesting. And I'm sure there are other options out there. There are probably some crazy combos you can do with this card. So if you have any ideas about how you'd use the Renew on this card and what creature you think would be the best thing to hit and turn your whole board into copies of that creature, definitely let me know in the comments, because I feel like this is another one where there's a ton of potential, ton of untapped potential, and it could go so far. The sky's the limit with all of the different ways you can use this. And in a standard meta where we have access to plenty of ways to self-mill and fill up our graveyard, that gets especially exciting. So if you have ideas about what we target with this and turn our whole board into copies of, definitely let me know in the comments, because this thing just has a ton of potential. It's super nuts. But that brings us to our last card of the day, Rot Curse Rakshasa, a 5/5 demon with trample for 1 black and 1. I know what you're asking, how the hell can this only be a 2-drop? Don't get ahead of yourselves. It also has Decayed. which means it can't block. And when it attacks, you have to sacrifice it at the end of combat. And we'll get back to why I think this card can be good just as a creature in play regardless of the decay in a moment. But first, we'll finish talking about the rest of the abilities on the card. It has Renew for 2 black and X. You exile this card from your graveyard, put a decayed counter on each of X target creatures, activate only as a sorcery. So from the graveyard, whether it died first or you just self-mill this into the graveyard, you can use this as pseudo removal, right? You just turn all of your opponent's creatures into decayed creatures. They can no longer block, which means if you're in an aggressive deck, you essentially already board wiped them, right? It's just as good as a board wipe if you're only worried about them blocking. They can't block with any of them anymore. But also, if they attack, they have to sacrifice them. So even if you use it against like a very aggressive deck, they get one more attack with each of those creatures and then they're gone. You could also use things that trigger off of your opponent's creatures dying to get even more value, knowing that every single time one of them ends up attacking, they're going to have to sacrifice it. So that's really cool. But I'm going to go back to the decayed on the creature itself because there are some interesting ways to use this creature regardless. Like the most obvious is you can use like a fling effect on this, right? Creature only costs you 2 mana, even though it can't block, you can just fling it at your opponent for 5. And if it's an instant speed fling effect, you can attack, get through for trample damage, and then it only gets sacrificed at end of combat. So there is a window to, after dealing damage, you can toss it at your opponent's head as well, which is pretty interesting. But the best couple ways to use this, the first of all, there's 2 really good ways to use this. The first of all is with fight spells or bite spells. Even though you can't block with this creature and you don't really want to attack with this creature, you can still use it to target fight spells and bite spells at your opponent's creatures to kill them way earlier in the game than you should have access to that much damage from a fight or bite spell, since this is only a 2-drop. And that's pretty interesting. But I think the best way to use this is just like with vehicles and mounts. Because even though this can't attack or block itself, it can crew a vehicle all day. And it can crew a vehicle with a really high crew cost of up to 5 and be awesome. And then in similar fashion, you can saddle mounts and get the value out of the mounts for a guy that only costs you 2 mana to get out. And then in a similar fashion, you also have the Harmonize mechanic within this set that allows you to flashback something from the graveyard and reduce the cost of that flashback cost by the power of a thing that you tap while playing it. In this case, you've got 5 power for only 2 mana, so you could probably start, flashing back all of your Harmonize stuff with this guy. Just almost use him as a way to generate 5 mana each turn that can only be used for Harmonize spells. And you just start flashing back 1 a turn, every turn, from your graveyard and getting insane value because it's costing you next to nothing to flash those things back. So there are a lot of hidden ways to use this card in really good ways. And I think that's exciting design space to build around. Even more exciting when you take into account the possibility of using multiple of those ways of using this in the same deck. Maybe you have a deck that has vehicles and mounts and is also running a bunch of Harmonize, and something like this just works over time, being able to be used in a ton of different ways. And that's even not taking into account the Renew ability and the fact that you get to use it as pseudo board wipe later on in the game. It just adds a lot to the value you can get out of this card and makes it kind of nuts in my opinion. So I do think there's potential for this card to be insanely good in the right decks. I'm excited to just hit the ground running and brew with it because the sky is truly the limit with a card like this, with just how many different ways you can figure out to suck out the potential of the Rakshasa. But that's going to do it for today. Thank you guys so much for checking out the video. This means we are pretty much all caught up with all of the first week, the week 1 spoilers and the weekend spoilers, and I should finally be able to get back to doing the spoiler videos on time every single day. So the next one that comes out is going to cover Monday and Tuesday spoilers, and then Wednesday will be right on its heels. Excited about that. Thank you so much for checking out the video. Please like it, please subscribe. All that stuff really helps my numbers, helps the channel grow. I appreciate it so much. Catch me live Monday through Friday over on Twitch. That's twitch.tv/QuarantineCapricorn, because if I'm alive and I'm breathing, I'm there and I'm streaming. And if you have any interest whatsoever in Wonders of the First, the brand new card game that I am just losing my mind excited about right now, keep your eyes peeled because I have a ton of videos on the way from the first Shattering where we basically celebrated the launch of that game, and I have a ton of product. I played a ton of games. I had insane fun. In fact, I had the most fun playing Limited that I've ever had playing Limited in any game ever. Playing Sealed for Wonders of the First this weekend. It was so good, and I can't wait to dive in and just explain why this game is so good. It's coming at a time when Magic's starting to lose its luster, between Arena feeling like it has rough economy and Alchemy being annoying and Universes Beyond taking over. I think Wonders of the First is in a very interesting, unique spot to really be a very good alternative to Magic right now, and I will not be surprised at all if we start to see a mass exodus of people being disillusioned with Magic and giving Wonders a try, because the game is awesome. And I'm going to shut up about it because this isn't the right video to talk about that stuff, but those videos are on the way, so keep your eyes peeled, and I'll see you next time. Thanks so much for checking out my channel. I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons over at Patreon. Without you guys, this channel would not be possible, so honestly, thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of your contributions. If you haven't yet, like and subscribe. The more likes we get and the quicker we get them, the bigger this channel will grow and the faster it will grow. I'd love nothing more than this channel to become something very special for you guys, but it's entirely up to you how fast that happens. Also, if you'd like more deck text, that's somewhere over there. And if you'd like to see what else the channel's been up to lately, that's somewhere up that way. Also, subscribe, circle below, do all the things.